There are times in history when a man lives when it doesn't make sense, when people swear to what they saw, but no one can figure out how it happened. In 1847, Baron Wilhelm Vannier, a rich landowner in Georgia, came up with what he thought would be the best punishment for a slave who had embarrassed him in front of important guests. The plan was simple, cruel, and foolproof. Put the man in a strong pen with 6 of the meanest bulls on the property, bulls that had killed 3 men with their horns in the last 2 years, bulls that charged at anything that moved. The Baron gave clear orders. The slave would stay there for 3 days without food or water. He would get his freedom if he lived, but no one thought he would last 3 hours. What happened next became the county's most disturbing mystery ever. The slave walked out of the pen unharmed 72 hours later, though, and all 6 bulls followed him like dogs that listen. Not only did they follow him, but they also wouldn't leave his side. They turned docile, almost like they were protecting themselves. And in 2 weeks, 14 more bulls from nearby farms showed up at the plantation gates, calm and obedient, looking for only one thing: to be near that man. 20 bulls, all following him, all changed. The Baron never brought it up again. 3 months later, he was found dead in his study with the door locked from the inside. His face was frozen in a look of pure terror, and the slave, he, disappeared. That same night, he left with nothing but a line of 20 bulls that 7 witnesses say followed him silently into the dark Georgia woods. This is the story of what really happened in that pen, and why no one has ever been able to figure it out. Before we go on with the story of Tobias and the 20 bulls that followed him into legend, I want to ask you something, if you like this in-depth look at one of history's most. If you like unsettling mysteries, please think about subscribing to the channel. Every week, we bring you stories like this, stories that mix up real events with things that can't be explained. If you want to see more, hit that like button. Also, make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. Let's go back to Georgia in 1847 and find out what really happened on Baron Vannier's plantation. In the 1840s, Georgia was a place where land and work were used to measure power. The plantation system had reached its peak, and people like Baron Wilhelm Vannier were the most powerful people in that world. Vannier did not come from the U.S. He came from the Netherlands in 1829 with a lot of money he had made in the spice trade, and a bad reputation for being ruthless in business, which made him rich but hated in Europe. There were rumors about him that spread across the Atlantic. Rumors of workers being exploited in Java, ships that disappeared with valuable cargo, and business partners who had mysteriously died right before big deals were about to be signed. There was never any proof, but the pattern was clear enough that respectable Dutch society had quietly shut its doors to him. America, especially the South, had something to offer Vannier that Europe no longer did. A place where it was rude to ask about a man's past, where money was more important than reputation, and where the social structure let rich men have almost unlimited power over those below them. He bought a large estate close to the town of Valdosta in southern Georgia, turning it into one of the most profitable cotton plantations in the area. The land was almost 3,000 acres of prime farmland, with thick pine forest to the east and the Lacucci River to the west. But Vandermeer was obsessed with more than just cotton and cattle. He was obsessed with bulls. He had become obsessed with this while living in Spain, where he saw bullfighting and became fascinated by the animal's raw strength and aggression. He started bringing in European breeding stock, especially aggressive bull breeds that are used in Spain and Portugal for fighting. He thought these animals were strong and powerful, which were the most important things to him. People in the county feared and talked about his collection of bulls. People at work talked in hushed tones about the devil's herd. bulls that were so mean they had killed 3 men who tried to handle them. The first death happened in 1845. Henry, a worker who had worked with cattle on a previous plantation, had been given the job of moving one of the bulls to a different pen. At first, the bull, a huge gray beast Vanier had named Titan, seemed calm. But as soon as Henry walked into the pen with a lead rope, Titan charged. The attack happened so quickly and violently that the other workers who saw it couldn't do anything in time. They were able to get Henry's body out and distract the bull, but he was already dead. His chest was crushed, several ribs were broken, and they were pushed into his lungs. 6 months later, the second death happened. A man named Peter, who was young, had to feed the bulls when he was only 20. He had been told to be careful when he got to the pen and to slide the feed through a hole in the fence. But one of the bulls, a black beast with scars on its sides that Vanier called Goliath, had somehow gotten its head through the gap and bit Peter's arm. The bull pulled so hard that Peter was thrown against the fence, where his arm broke in the 3 places and his shoulder dislocated. Other workers had quickly gone too. Help, but in the chaos, Peter fell and hit his head on a fence post. 2 days later, he died without ever waking up. His arm was so badly broken that the plantation's doctor said he would have lost it even if he had lived. The third death was the worst. Samuel, who had worked with animals for more than 15 years and was thought to be one of the best handlers on the property, was told to take care of an injury on one of the bulls. The animal had gotten a deep cut on its leg, and Vanier wanted it to be treated so it wouldn't get sick. Samuel had been careful when he got close, speaking softly to the bull and moving slowly. He had gotten close enough to look at the wound, but when he touched the bull's leg it went crazy and attacked. It had stood up, and its hooves hit Samuel in the head and chest. The other workers were able to get Samuel out, but he died within minutes. His skull was broken, and blood was pouring from his nose and ears. After Samuel died, Vandermeer added more iron bars and thicker posts to the pen to make it stronger. He also said that no worker should ever be able to get into the pen. There would be special chutes on the outside of the bulls' pens that would feed them. There would be troughs that could be filled with water from a safe distance. The bulls would live in that pen, which was dangerous and isolated. It was a sign of Vanier's wealth and his ability to keep something that didn't serve any real purpose other than to show off his power. The plantation itself was a world all its own. More than 200 people lived and worked there, and most of them were slaves. Vanier had complete control over their lives. The main house was a big, beautiful building in the Greek Revival style that rich Southerners liked at the time. White columns, wide porches, and tall windows that let in any breeze during the hot summer months. The house was on a small hill, and Vanier could see the whole plantation from his second-floor study, the fields of cotton. The worker quarters were lined up in neat rows, and the barns and storage buildings were far to the east. The bullpen was a dark square against the trees. Vanier was cruel on purpose. He didn't beat his slaves himself. He thought that kind of behavior was beneath him and showed that someone had lost control. Instead, he hired Dalton, a thin, tough man from South Carolina who was known for being efficient and brutal, to be in charge. Dalton took care of the physical enforcement of rules. Vandermeer was in charge of the psychological control, and he thought it was important to make examples of people by putting them in situations where they would humiliate themselves or each other. He also wanted to create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty where no one could ever feel safe. He would, for example, say that he was thinking about giving one of the enslaved workers their freedom. Then, for weeks, he would have different people audition for the chance to do tasks or answer questions, giving them hope. Only 2, to finally say that none of them had shown they were worthy. Or he would put workers against each other, promising prizes to the person who picked the most cotton in a week, then coming up with reasons to disqualify the winner and give the prize to someone else. The only reason he played these games was to have fun and keep complete control. Margaret, his wife, was a quiet woman from a good Dutch family that had fallen on hard times. She married Vandermeer because she had to, not because she loved him. He wanted to marry into an old European family because it would give him social status, and her family needed the money he could give them. She spent most of her time in the main house, where she took care of the staff, read, and wrote letters to family back in the Netherlands. She didn't talk about her husband's business very often, and when she did, it was always in the most general diplomatic terms. People who knew her well, like her personal maid, the cook, and a few of the other servants, whispered that. She was very unhappy, and she often cried in her room. She had tried to leave once, but was either persuaded or threatened to stay. The plantation's social structure was complicated and well kept. Vanier and his wife were at the top, followed by a small group of white overseers and managers. Next were skilled workers, some of whom were enslaved, and some of whom were free blacks who worked for wages. Next were field workers, and at the very bottom were people who had been labeled as troublemakers or were being punished. It was very rare for people to move between these tiers, and it was entirely up to Vandermeer. There was a man named Tobias who was a slave. No one knew for sure how old he was. He looked like he was in his 30s, but his eyes made him look much older. 5 years before, he had been bought at an auction in Savannah. He was part of a group that had come from a plantation in South Carolina that had gone bankrupt after a series of bad harvests and poor investments. The auction records only said that he was Tobias Mayo, about 30 years old, field worker, no known family. But the people who had traveled with him from South Carolina told a different story. They said Tobias had been different ever since they met him. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was important. People felt uneasy when he looked at them because it seemed like he could see through their faces and into something deeper. Some of the other enslaved people from South Carolina said that Tobias was born in Africa and brought over as a slave. He was a child and still remembered the old ways, languages, and beliefs. Some people said he was born in America, but learned from someone who knew those things. Some people said in a low voice that he wasn't completely human and that he was something else in a human body. But these whispers were always quickly stopped. People who talked like that were in danger of being accused of practicing illegal religions or planning uprisings. Everyone agreed that Tobias had a strange gift with beasts. Horses that were scared and hard to handle would calm down when he was around. When he came near, dogs that barked at everyone else would sit still. It seemed like even wild animals acted differently around him. Workers said they saw him stand perfectly still in the fields, while deer grazed nearby. He didn't seem scared or bothered when birds landed on his arms and shoulders like he was a tree. When Vanner bought Tobias, he first put him to work in the field. But after a week, the stable master, who was an older free, a black man named Marcus, had asked that Tobias be moved to work with the horses. Marcus had seen how Tobias affected the animals and knew it was something good. Vandermeer had agreed, always wanting to get the most out of everything, and Tobias had been moved to the stables. Tobias had worked there quietly and well for 5 years. He took care of the horses, kept the tack and equipment in good shape, and sometimes helped with other animals when they needed it. He lived in a small room next to the stable that was separate from the main living area for workers. He liked being alone. He spent his evenings and Sundays alone. On Sundays, most of the enslaved people went to the supervised religious services that Vandermeer allowed because he thought that controlled religion kept people docile. Tobias would go into the woods and not come back until after dark. Some people thought this behavior was strange. Dalton, the boss, had asked Tobias about it several times, wanting to know what he was doing in the woods. Tobias always said the same thing: "I'm walking, praying, and thinking." There wasn't enough to punish him for. He wasn't breaking any clear rules, but it made him someone to keep an eye on. Tobias talked to Marcus, the stable master, more often than most other people. Marcus was in his 60s. He had been born into slavery, but 20 years earlier he had bought his freedom with a mix of saved wages and a big loan from a Quaker merchant who was against slavery. He chose to stay in the South and work for money, which he sent to his family. Members who were still slaves, hoping to be able to buy their freedom too. He was a cautious person who knew how to get around the dangerous parts of Southern society without making waves. Marcus had tried to get Tobias to open up about himself several times, but Tobias always kept his guard up. Marcus had only ever talked to him once. Late one night, both men were in the stable taking care of a horse that had a bad cough. "You've got a gift," Marcus had said. As Tobias held his hand on the horse's neck, the animal's breathing slowly got steadier. "I've been around horses my whole life, but I've never met anyone who could touch them like you can." Tobias had not said anything for a long time. Then he said softly, "It's not a gift, it's understanding." Understanding what? That they aren't all that different from us. They are scared, they are in pain, they want to be safe. If you really get that, they know what it means. They know. Marcus had nodded slowly. "Where did you find that out?" Tobias had looked at him then, and Marcus had felt the same uncomfortable feeling that other people had talked about. The feeling of being seen too clearly by someone who understood it better than I do, Tobias had said. Someone who's gone now. He hadn't said much more, and Marcus hadn't pushed, but the conversation had stayed with him. There was something about Tobias that didn't quite fit the world they lived in. He was too calm, too centered, and too unafraid in a place where fear was the main way to control people. Vanir had also noticed Tobias's gift, but he saw it differently. He thought it was a useful skill that could be used to get what he wanted. He had used Tobias several times to handle difficult livestock, and it always worked. But he also thought it was suspicious. Vandermeer didn't like things he couldn't understand, and Tobias's effect on animals felt like something beyond normal skill. Vanir couldn't stand the idea that anyone on his plantation had power that didn't come directly from him. This tension had been building for 5 years, but it was never spoken about. Then, on a warm April evening in 1847, the incident that would change everything happened. Vanmeer was hosting a dinner for several prominent plantation owners from neighboring counties. These gatherings were important to him. They were. He planned this dinner for weeks, making sure that every detail was perfect. The guest list included some of the most powerful men in southern Georgia. Colonel James Hartley, who owned a plantation twice the size of Vanner's and had connections to the state legislature, was there. Richard Brennan, a wealthy merchant who controlled much of the cotton trade in the area, was also there. The area. There was Thomas Fairfax, a lawyer who had successfully defended several plantation owners in legal disputes over property and labor. And there were their wives, elegant women in expensive dresses, who would spend the evening discussing fashion and gossip while the men talked business. The dinner itself was elaborate. Vanir had ordered his cook, an enslaved woman named Ruth, who had trained in Charleston and was known for her skill with French cuisine, to prepare a feast. Roasted duck, venison, fresh fish from the river, vegetables from the plantation's gardens, imported wines and fancy desserts. The dining room was filled with flowers and candles, and the silver was polished until it shone. The crystal glasses were perfectly arranged. The dinner went well. The food was good, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation was lively. Vanner held court at the head of the table, telling stories about his travels in Europe and Asia, making fun of northern abolitionists, and talking about the latest political developments in Washington. He was in his element, performing for an audience that appreciated his wealth and power. After dinner, as was customary, the men retired to Vandermeer's study for brandy and cigars while the women remained in the parlor. It was during this time that Vanneer made his mistake. He had been drinking heavily, feeling expansive and confident, and he decided to give his guests a tour of his prized bulls. "Gentlemen," he announced, standing and gesturing toward the window, "I have something that I know you've never seen before. The most beautiful and dangerous bulls in Georgia, and maybe even in all of America." The men followed him outside with their brandy glasses, laughing and talking. The weather was nice that night. The air was warm but not too hot, and a light breeze brought the smell of jasmine from the gardens. They walked across the grounds, past the worker quarters where people watched quietly from windows and doors, and past the cotton fields where the plants were just starting to grow on the eastern edge of the property, where the bullpen was. The pen was a big, strong building that kept animals inside that most men wouldn't want to get near. The fence was made of thick wooden posts that were sunk 4 feet into the ground and held together with iron bars. The posts were very close together, so close that even a determined bull couldn't get through. The gate was just as strong, made of thick wood and held shut with several iron locks and chains. 6 bulls moved around in the pen, which was about 60 feet by 40 feet as the light faded. Vanneer started to talk about each bull, pointing them out with clear pride. "That gray beast over there is Titan, and it came from Spain. In 1845, it killed a man by crushing his chest like it was made of paper. That black one with the scars is Goliath. He's from Portugal and has killed 2 people. The other ones are just as dangerous. I keep them here to remind me of what power looks like. Strength without mercy, dominance without question," the guests said. Thankfully, even though some of them looked nervous. These were men who knew how to use violence and power, but it was strange to keep these dangerous animals around just for show. As Vandermeer kept talking, Goliath started to get upset. The huge black bull started to stomp its feet, snort, and shake its head. Then it ran at the fence and hit it with a lot of force, power. The impact was so strong that the whole fence shook, and a few of the guests stepped back without thinking. Vandermeer laughed, clearly happy with how they reacted. "Don't worry, guys. The fence is strong. These animals can throw themselves against it all day and not break through. I had it built just for them." Goliath charged again, and this time the other bulls joined in. They all ran at the fence, bellowing with rage. It was so loud that it sounded like a choir. Animal rage that rang out across the plantation. The guests were not smiling anymore. Vandermeer even looked a little worried, but he tried to hide it. "They're more upset than usual," he said, raising his voice so people could hear him over the noise. "Maybe they can feel that there are so many people around." And then, as if on cue, Tobias showed up. He had been working in the stable, which was about 50 yards from the bullpen. He had heard the noise and come to check it out. He thought that maybe one of the horses had been scared by the noise. He was carrying a bucket of feed, his work clothes were dusty, and his face was blank. But as soon as Tobias got within 20 feet of the pen, everything changed. The bulls stopped, not slowly, not gradually. They just stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Goliath, who had been charging, planted his hooves and stood perfectly still. The other bulls did the same. The bellowing stopped. The only sound was the evening breeze rustling through the pine trees. The silence was more disturbing than the noise had been. All 6 bulls turned to face Tobias. They didn't move toward him or act aggressively. They just stood there watching him with what could only be described as focused attention. Their breathing slowed and their bodies relaxed. It was as if they had forgotten the fence, the men standing on the other side, and everything else except for this one person. Vandermeer stared at Tobias, his face darkening. The guests looked between. Tobias and the bulls were both confused and interested. Colonel Hartley, who had had more brandy than the others and was feeling brave, laughed nervously. "Well, Baron, it looks like your slave has more control over your bulls than you do. You might want to have him show them around instead." Hartley said it as a joke, a light-hearted comment to break the tension. But as soon as the words left Hartley's mouth, the mood changed. Vandermeer's face went from confused to something darker. Anger and shame mixed together. The other guests stopped talking right away, knowing something was wrong. Vandermeer turned slowly to Hartley and asked, "Is that so?" he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone uncomfortable. Hartley, realizing his mistake, tried to backtrack. "I meant no offense, Baron. I was just commenting on how amazing your man seems to be at making animals do things. It's really impressive, but the damage was done. Vanir had been. He was embarrassed in front of his peers. His authority was questioned, his power was weakened, and he had been embarrassed by a slave, someone who was supposed to be beneath notice and consideration. This was unacceptable." Vanir looked at Tobias, who had frozen in place, and understood right away that something terrible had just been set in motion. Tobias's face stayed neutral, but his eyes showed a flicker of something. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He knew what was coming. "Tobias, come here," Vandermeer said, and his voice carried over the space between them. Tobias put down his bucket and slowly walked over to the group of men. He kept his head down and his body language submissive, acting the way he was supposed to. But everyone watching could tell that it was all an act, that Tobias was not what he seemed. When he got to the fence, Vandermeer looked at him for a long time. The bulls stayed calm, still watching Tobias and ignoring everything else. Vandermeer said, "You have a gift with animals." It wasn't a question. Tobias replied quietly, "I work with them, sir. I've learned their ways." Vandermeer repeated his tone, mocking, "How modest. Colonel Hartley here seems to think you have more control over my bulls than I do. What do you think about that?" Tobias said nothing. There was no safe answer to that question. Vandermeer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think we should test that theory. I think we should see just how much control you really have." The guests shifted uncomfortably. They could sense where this was going, and none of them liked it. "Baron," Thomas Fairfax said carefully, "perhaps we should return to the house." "The evening is getting late and nonsense," Vandermeer interrupted. "The evening is just getting interesting. Gentlemen, I'm going to make a wager with my slave here, a generous wager, in fact." He turned back to Tobias. "Here's my offer. You will spend 3 days in that pen with those bulls. 3 full days. No food, no water, no shelter. If you live, I'll give you your freedom and $50. That's more money than most free men see in a year. You'll be able to go wherever you want and do whatever you want. You'll be free." The guests were quiet, shocked by the offer. $50 was a lot of money, and the promise of freedom was something that anyone who was enslaved would want. But the price was almost certainly death. Everyone there had heard the stories about Vandermeer's. 3 men had already died. The idea that anyone could survive 3 days locked in with those animals was ridiculous. "And if I refuse?" Tobias asked quietly. Vandermeer's smile grew wider. "Then I'll assume you were lying about your gift, that you're nothing special, just another slave who got lucky a few times. And I'll have you sold to a plantation in Alabama. I hear they work their people very hard there, much harder than I do. You probably wouldn't last a year. It was a trap and everyone knew it. If Tobias refused, and he would be punished. If he accepted, he would almost certainly die. But there was a third option that Vanir hadn't thought of. Tobias might actually live. And if he did, Vanir would have to keep his word in front of witnesses or risk losing face with his peers. Tobias looked at the bulls, who were still standing calmly in the pen and watching him. Then he looked back at Vandermeer. "I accept," he said. Vandermeer's smile faltered for a moment, as if he hadn't expected Tobias to agree so quickly. But he got better quickly. "Great. We'll start tomorrow at dawn. I want everyone on the plantation to see this. It will be educational." The guests were quiet as they walked back to the main house. The evening's entertainment had taken a dark turn, and none of them were comfortable with what they had just seen, but none of them spoke up to stop it either. This was Vandermeer's property, his slave, his decision. To interfere would be to question his authority, and that was something none of them wanted to do. That night, news spread quickly through the plantation about what was going to happen. Workers gathered in small groups, whispering and guessing. Some thought Tobias was brave, while others thought he was foolish. A few thought he might actually survive, but they couldn't say why they thought that. Marcus, the stable master, went to Tobias's room next to the stable. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said. "We could find a way to get. You need to leave. People help runaways. I know some names and places." "No," Tobias said calmly. "Running would only make things worse for me and everyone else here. Vandermeer would be angry with all of you." "But I know those bulls," Tobias said. "Since the first time I got here, I knew something like this would happen eventually. People like Vandermeer can't stand things they don't understand, and they really can't stand it when it makes them look not strong." Marcus sat down hard on a wooden crate. "You're just going to walk into that pen and die," he said. Tobias looked at him, and Marcus saw something in his eyes that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't fear or resignation, but something else, something that looked almost like it was certain. Tobias said in a low voice, "I'm going to walk into that pen. What happens next? We will see." The next morning, the sky was gray, the clouds hid the sun, and the air smelled like rain. Vandermeer had told everyone on the plantation to meet near the bullpen. This was going to be a public event to show off his power and warn anyone who might think about questioning his authority. More than 200 people gathered in a loose semicircle around the pen. The enslaved workers stood in groups, their faces carefully blank. They knew that showing any emotion could be seen as sympathy for Tobias and lead to punishment. The overseers and managers stood closer to the pen, holding rifles and whips, ready to step in if the bulls somehow got through the fence. The servant of Vanir stood near the main house and watched from a distance. Margaret had even come out to stand on the veer with her maid, and her face was pale. Vandermeer himself stood right in front of the pen's gate, dressed in his best clothes, as if this were a formal event. Dalton stood next to him with the keys to the gate's locks. A few of the guests from the night before had stayed over, and they stood close by, looking uncomfortable but not wanting to leave. Leaving now would be an insult to Vandermeer, and none of them could afford that. Two overseers brought Tobias forward. He had on the same plain work clothes that he had worn the night before. He wore canvas pants, a rough cotton shirt, and old boots. He had no ties on his hands. He looked at the pen, then at the bulls that were moving around inside, and finally at Vandermeer. 3 days, Vandermeer yelled, and his voice carried across the crowd. 72 hours. If you live, you get to walk away with $50 in your pocket. He shrugged and said, "If you die." "Well, you should have been more careful around my bulls." Some of the overseers laughed, but it sounded forced and uncomfortable. Most of the people in the crowd stayed quiet. Vandermeer nodded to Dalton, who then stepped forward and started to open the gate. The chains made a loud noise when they were taken off, which was very quiet in the morning. The hinges creaked as the gate swung open. Vanneer said, "Go in." Tobias walked, without thinking, forward. He walked through the gate and into the pen, moving slowly and with purpose. As soon as he got inside, Dalton closed the gate and locked it, the chains clanking back into place. Nothing happened for the first few minutes. The bulls stopped moving around the pen and turned to look at Tobias. He stood still in the middle of the enclosure, hardly breathing. He had his eyes closed and his hands hanging down at his sides. He looked like he was praying or meditating, not moving at all. The crowd was very quiet. Some people were holding their breath. Some people were saying prayers quietly. Some of the kids who had been brought to see this were crying, and their parents told them to be quiet. Then Goliath, the huge black bull that had killed 2 men, started to move. It dropped its head and poured down, its muscles getting tense. Everyone who saw it knew what it meant. The bull was getting ready to charge. A lot of people in the crowd gasped. A woman yelled. Vandermeer leaned in. He looked at Tobias with a small smile on his face. Goliath ran at them. The bull ran at Tobias with terrifying speed, its hooves thundering against the ground, its head down and its horns aimed right at him. It crossed the distance in seconds, and for a moment it seemed like Tobias would be gored, trampled, and killed right away. But just as Goliath was about to hit Tobias, he opened his eyes. He put his palm out and raised one hand. Not really a word, not really a song, but something in between. It was deep and low, like it was coming from deep in his chest, and it came across the pen with strange clarity. Goliath came to a stop. The bull's speed should have pushed it forward. An animal that big and moving that fast shouldn't have been able to stop so quickly. But Goliath planted its hooves and stood still, 3 feet away from Tobias, breathing heavily and staring at him with dark, watery eyes. People in the crowd gasped in shock. Vanneer's smile faded away. He got a little closer too. The fence with his hands on the iron bars. The other 5 bulls moved slowly toward Tobias and Goliath, making a loose circle around them. They didn't attack. They didn't make threats. They just got closer, lowered their heads, and stared at Tobias. Tobias stood there for a long time with his hand raised, that weird noise that was still coming from him. Then he slowly lowered his hand and took a step toward Goliath. The bull stayed still. Tobias kept walking until he was standing, right in front of the huge animal. He reached out and put his hand on Goliath's forehead, right between the eyes of the bull. The effect was immediate and very strong. It looked like Goliath's whole body relaxed. The muscles relaxed, and the tension went away. It started to breathe more slowly and deeply. The bull closed its eyes and leaned slightly into Tobias's touch, like a dog does when its owner pets it. The other bulls got closer and formed a tight circle around Tobias, but they weren't being aggressive. Actions. They were calm, almost gentle, and their huge bodies moved carefully so they wouldn't bump into each other or Tobias. Vandermeer looked at the scene with a pale face and a tight jaw. He didn't think this would happen. This wasn't supposed to happen. The bulls should have killed Tobias in a matter of hours, if not minutes. Instead, they were acting like pets, like animals that had lived with Tobias their whole lives. "Give it time," said Vandermeer. Talked to himself more than to anyone else. "They'll kill him when he sleeps or shows weakness." But as the hours went by, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. Tobias stayed in the center of the pen, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting cross-legged on the ground, and sometimes walking slowly in small circles. The bulls stayed close to him, keeping a respectful distance of a few feet, but never leaving. They didn't show any signs of aggression. They They didn't charge the fence or fight with each other. They just stayed calm and focused in that space with Tobias. By noon, most of the crowd had left to go back to work. Veneer had ordered that someone must always be watching the pen, so workers took turns standing guard and reporting back on what they saw, but there wasn't much to report. Tobias and the bulls stayed in their strange tableau hour after hour, as the sun moved across the sky. Vandermeer visited the pen. 3 times that first day, he stood at the fence and stared at Tobias with a look that got darker each time. He didn't say anything. He just watched, gripping the iron bars until his knuckles turned white. That night, as darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the pen so the guards could keep an eye on things. Finally, Tobias sat down, crossing his legs and straightening his back in the middle of the pen. One by one, the bulls lay down in a circle around him, their massive bodies forming a protective barrier between him and the fence. They arranged themselves with their heads facing outward like guards on watch. Their bodies formed a barrier between Tobias and the fence. They stood with their heads facing outward like guards on watch. The workers who saw this told Vandermeer, who came out to see for himself. He stood at the fence for over an hour, watching as Tobias sat still in the middle of that circle of bulls, his eyes closed and his breathing slow and steady. The bulls didn't sleep, or if they did, it was in shifts because there were always at least 2 or 3 of them with their eyes open, watching the darkness beyond the fence. Of them with their eyes open, watching the darkness beyond the fence. Vandermeer finally turned and walked back to the main house without saying a word. But those who saw his face said he looked like a man who had seen something that shattered his understanding of the world. The second day began with rain. Not a heavy downpour, but a steady drizzle that turned the ground inside the pen to mud and made everything gray and miserable. The workers who came to watch expected to see Tobias suffering, cold, wet, exhausted from a night, without sleep, but when they got to the pen, they saw something else. Tobias was standing in the middle of the pen, his face turned up to the sky and his arms spread out like he was welcoming the rain. The bulls were standing around him in a protective circle, blocking most of the wind and making a kind of shelter. And Tobias looked peaceful, not in pain or struggling, but peaceful, as if the rain and the cold and the lack of food and water didn't matter to him. One of the workers, a young woman, Sarah, who worked in the main house, later told others that watching Tobias at that moment made her cry, but she couldn't say why. She said he looked free. Even though he was locked in that pen and surrounded by those bulls, he looked more free than any of us have ever been. As the morning went on, something strange started to happen. The bulls began to move in patterns, not random movements, but deliberate, coordinated patterns. They would walk in a slow circle around Tobias, all moving in the same direction, their steps synchronized. Then they would stop, stand still for several minutes, and begin again. It looked almost like a dance or a ritual. The workers watching were disturbed by this. It was too organized, too purposeful. Bulls weren't supposed to behave this way. They were supposed to be aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous. But these bulls were moving with the precision of trained performers, and the only explanation anyone could offer was that Tobias was somehow directing them. They would walk in the same direction, their steps in sync. Then they would stop, stand still for a few minutes, and start again. It looked almost like a dance or a ritual. The workers watching were disturbed by this. It was too organized and purposeful. Bulls weren't supposed to act this way. They were supposed to be aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerous. But these bulls were moving with the precision of trained performers. The only explanation anyone could come up with was that Tobias was somehow directing them. But he wasn't giving any visible signals. He wasn't speaking or gesturing. He was just standing there, and the bulls were responding to something no one else could see or hear. Vandermeer came to the pen around noon, accompanied by Dalton and 2 other overseers. He looked like he hadn't slept. His clothes were rumpled, his hair uncombed, his eyes bloodshot. He stood at the fence, staring at Tobias and the bulls, his expression a mixture of rage and something else, fear, perhaps, or confusion. How is this possible? He muttered, "How is he doing this?" Dalton, standing beside him, shook his head. "I don't know, sir. I've never seen anything like it. Those bulls, they're not acting natural. It's like they're under some kind of spell." Vandermeer turned sharply to look at him. "Spell? Are you suggesting witchcraft?" Dalton looked uncomfortable. "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm just saying it's not natural. Bulls don't behave this way, not without training." And even then, Vannier turned back to the pen. There had to be an explanation, a logical one. He was using some method or technique to control them, maybe sounds we can't hear or movements we aren't seeing. There had to be something, but as the day went on, no one could figure out what that something might be. Tobias kept his strange vigil, and the bulls kept acting strangely, and everyone who watched felt more and more uneasy. That afternoon, something even more disturbing happened. One of the bulls, the brown one with Brutus, the bull with scarred flanks that Vandermeer had named, walked up to Tobias and lowered its head until its forehead touched Tobias's chest. Tobias put both hands on the bull's head and stood that way for almost an hour, completely still. The workers who were watching said that during this time, Tobias and the bull seemed to be breathing in perfect sync, inhaling and exhaling in the same rhythm over and over again. And even more strange, the other bulls had stopped moving. Entirely. They stood frozen in place like statues, their eyes fixed on Tobias and Brutus as if witnessing something sacred. When the hour was up, Tobias removed his hands from the bull's head. Brutus stepped back, shook its head once, and then returned to the circle. The other bulls resumed their slow patterned movements, and Tobias sat down in the mud, cross-legged, his eyes closed, rain still falling on his upturned face. By the evening of the second day, word of what was happening had spread beyond the plantation. People from nearby properties started to show up, asking to see the show. Vandermeer, who would normally have welcomed the attention, instead ordered the gates closed and guards posted to keep people out. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want this story to spread any further than it already had. But stories have a way of spreading no matter what anyone wants. Workers from Vandermeer's plantation had family and friends on other plantations, and they talked. Merchants and traders people who passed through heard the rumors and spread them to the next town. Within days, the story of the slave who survived 2 days locked in a pen with 6 killer bulls was being told in taverns, churches, and general stores all over southern Georgia. Some versions of the story made Tobias out to be a saint, blessed by God with the power to tame wild animals. Other versions made him out to be something darker, a practitioner of African magic who had made deals with spirits or demons. A few people said he was Some people said he was a prophet sent to warn people about the evils of slavery. Others said he was just a lucky animal handler. But everyone agreed on the main points. Tobias was alive, the bulls were calm, and something strange was going on in that pen. On the second night, Vandermeer locked himself in his study and started drinking heavily. His wife, Margaret, tried to talk to him, but he told her to leave. The servants in the house said they heard him talking to himself. His voice went up and down, sometimes angry and sometimes pleading, as if he were arguing with someone who wasn't there. Around midnight, a young man named Daniel, one of the house servants who was in charge of keeping the fires going, passed by Vanier's study and heard him yelling. Daniel stopped to listen and then told others what he had heard. He said, "It's not possible. It's not possible," Daniel said over and over. Then he said something about he talked about how he owned the bulls and controlled them. Then he said, "He's taking them from me." He was scared when he said, "He's taking everything from me." I've never heard the Baron sound scared before. The third day dawned clear and bright, the rain having passed during the night. The ground inside the pen was still muddy, and Tobias was covered in it. His clothes, skin, and hair were all muddy, but he didn't look weak. If anything, he looked stronger. His eyes were clear and focused. When he stood up and stretched, his movements were smooth and controlled. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a good night's sleep, not someone who had been without food or water for 2 days, exposed to the elements and surrounded by dangerous animals. The bulls also seemed to be full of energy. They moved with purpose, their earlier lethargy replaced by a kind of vibrant alertness. They continued their patterned movements and synchronized walking, but now there was something almost joyful about it, as if they were. Vanir came to the pen just after dawn, with almost a dozen overseers and armed workers. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow, and his hands were shaking a little. He had clearly not slept. He stood at the fence and stared at Tobias for a long time without saying anything. Then Vandermeer said, "How are you doing this?" "Nothing," Tobias said calmly. "I'm just here." "That's not an answer." Vandermeer snapped. "Those bulls should have killed you. 3 men have died at their hands. They're violent, dangerous, and hard to predict. But they're acting like they trust me," Tobias said softly. Vandermeer's face twisted with anger. "You're using a trick or a method. What is it?" Tobias was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "There is no trick. I get them, and they get me. That's not possible." "Is it?" Tobias asked. "Or is it just a thing? You've never taken the time to learn." Vermeer felt the comment like a punch in the gut. His face turned white, then red with rage. "You have the nerve to talk to me like that? You are a slave. You are property. You are nothing." Tobias met his gaze steadily. "Why are you so scared of what's going on here if I'm nothing?" Vandermeer opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He stood there shaking with rage and something else. That fear that had been growing in him since this all started. Lastly, he turned and walked away without saying anything else, leaving the overseers standing awkwardly by the fence. As the morning went on, something that had never happened before started to happen. People who worked on the eastern edge of the plantation, close to the border with the next property, said they heard strange noises. The bulls were bellowing, but they weren't angry or upset. It sounded a lot like calling, like the bulls were talking to each other from far away. The reports had become more detailed by noon. Bulls from the fence around Hutchinson's plantation next door had been broken, and the animals were moving toward Vandermeer's property. They weren't running or stampeding. They were walking with purpose, as if something was pulling them there. Hutchinson himself got to Vandermeer's gates around 2 in the afternoon, angry and confused. He yelled at the guards, "Your man has done something to my bulls. They broke through a strong fence and are coming this way. I want to know what. What's going on?" Vandermeer got the message and came to the gates looking even worse than he had that morning. Vandermeer's face went white when Hutchinson told him what had happened. He asked, "How many bulls?" 5, Hutchinson said. 5 of my best breeding stock. They just left. They walked right through the fence like it wasn't there. They're heading toward your property, where you've got your slave locked up in that pen." What did he do? Vandermeer had no idea what to say. He told his overseers to try to catch the bulls and drive them back to Hutchinson's property. But when the overseers found the bulls, 5 huge animals walking in a loose group through the pine forest. They couldn't turn them. The bulls didn't listen to the overseer's shouts and whips. They just kept walking, their eyes fixed on something in the distance that only they could see. By late afternoon, the 5 bulls had reached Vandermeer's plantation and were standing at the gates, calm and patient, waiting. Workers tried to approach them to lead them away, but the bulls wouldn't move. They just stood there. Their attention focused on the distant bullpen where Tobias remained, and they weren't alone. Throughout the afternoon and evening, more bulls arrived. 3 from a plantation to the south owned by a man named Crawford. 4 from a property to the west belonging to a widow named Mrs. Pembroke. 2 from a small farm to the north. They came from different directions and properties, but they all ended up in the same place, outside Vandermeer's gates, waiting. By nightfall, 14 bulls from nearby properties had gathered. They stood in a loose group, not fighting or acting aggressively, just waiting. And every single one of them was facing the same direction, toward the pen where Tobias sat with Vandermeer's original 6 bulls. The plantation owners were furious because their bulls had disappeared. They came to Vandermeer's property. They wanted answers, compensation, and for him to do something to get their animals back. But Vandermeer had none to give. He stood on his porch, staring at the bulls that had gathered, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "I don't know," he kept saying. "I don't know how this is happening." The other plantation owners didn't believe him. They accused him of using some kind of bait or trick to lure their bulls away. Arguments broke out, and threats were made. The structure that had seemed so solid just days before was breaking apart, and at the center of it all was one man sitting in a pen with 6 bulls doing nothing but existing. That night, Vanier didn't sleep at all. He paced his study, drinking brandy, and staring out the window toward the distant pen. The house servants reported hearing him talk to himself again, his voice rising and falling, sometimes angry, sometimes desperate. Around midnight, Margaret finally forced her way into the study, ignoring his orders to leave him alone. "Wilhelm," she said in a strong voice, "you need to stop this. Let the guy go. Keep your promise. Let him go free and let this be over." Vanier looked at her, and she stepped back because she was scared of how he looked. "Let him go," he said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Let him go. Don't you see what's going on? He's taking my bulls. He's taking bulls from other men's properties. He's doing something. That shouldn't be possible. If I let him go, everyone will know that a slave beat me and that I couldn't do anything about it." "This isn't about power anymore," Margaretti said. "It's about survival, your survival. Can't you see what this is doing to you?" But Vanner wasn't listening. He turned back to the window and stared out into the darkness. Margaret left him there, alone with his obsession. The 3rd day ended at dawn on the 4th day, exactly 72 hours. After Tobias had been locked in the pen, Vandermeer had given orders for the gate to be opened at first light. A crowd had gathered to see it. There were enslaved workers, overseers, several neighboring plantation owners whose bulls had gone missing, and even a few townspeople who had heard the stories and come out to see how it ended. Vanier stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by Dalton and 4 armed overseers. He had told them to be ready for anything. If the bulls. When the gate opened, they were told to shoot. If Tobias tried to run away, they were told to stop him. Vanier's face was pale and drawn. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his hands were shaking a little. As the sun rose and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dalton stepped forward and began to unlock the gate. The chains rattled as they were taken off, which made a loud noise in the quiet of the morning. The crowd held its breath. The gate swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Tobias stood up slowly, brushing mud off his clothes. The 6 bulls rose with him, moving in perfect harmony. Their huge bodies unfolded with surprising grace. Tobias looked at the open gate, then at the bulls, then at the crowd of people watching him. He walked toward the gate, his movements calm and deliberate. The bulls followed, not aggressively or frantically. They just walked behind him, their heads down and their eyes focused on his back. They went through the gate in single file, with Goliath leading the way. Then the others came, and they formed a loose semicircle behind Tobias. The crowd instinctively stepped back, making a wide path. No one spoke or moved. They just watched as Tobias walked out of the pen and into the morning light, with 6 huge bulls following him like obedient dogs. Tobias stopped a few feet from Vanir. The 2 men looked at each other, and for a long time neither spoke. Tobias's face was unreadable. He wasn't angry, triumphant, or scared. He just knew, as if he understood something. Vandermeer never would. Something fundamental about the nature of power and control, and what it meant to truly connect with another living being. Vandermeer broke eye contact first, turning his head away sharply. "Get him off my property," he muttered to Dalton. Now, but before anyone could move, a sound rose from the direction of the gates, a deep, resonant bellowing. The 14 bulls that had gathered from neighboring properties were calling out, their voices echoing across the plantation, and then they began to move. They walked through the open gates, past the confused guards and the crowd that had gathered, and straight toward Tobias. When they got to him, they stopped and formed a larger circle around him and the original 6 bulls, making 20 bulls in all. They all stood calmly, focused on one man. The crowd gasped and murmured in shock. The neighboring plantation owners who had come to get their bulls back stared in disbelief. This was impossible. Bulls didn't act this way. They didn't form groups like this. They didn't follow a person. Vandermeer stepped back, his face pale. "Stop him," he said weakly. "Don't let him leave with those animals. He doesn't own them. They belong to me, to Hutchinson, to Crawford, to themselves," Tobias said quietly, speaking for the first time since leaving the pen. His voice was calm, but carried clearly across the crowd. "They always have. You just never understood that." Vandermeer's face twisted with rage. "You're a slave. You own nothing. You are nothing. Those bulls are property just like you." Tobias looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I was property," he said. "You promised me my freedom if I survived 3 days. I survived, so now I'm free, and these bulls," he gestured to the animals surrounding him. "They've made their choice. Shoot him!" Vanir suddenly shouted, turning to the armed overseers. "Shoot him and scatter those bulls." But none of the overseers moved. They looked at each other nervously, but no one raised their weapons. The sight of 20 huge bulls standing perfectly still around one man was too strange and scary. It felt wrong to get involved, as if doing so would break some natural law they didn't understand. Dalton stepped forward and spoke softly. "Sir, you made a promise in front of witnesses. If we break that promise now, your word will mean nothing. Every man here will know you can't be trusted." Vandermeer looked around at the crowd, at the plantation owners next door who were watching him, and at his. He was stuck. If he kept his word, he would lose faith by letting a slave beat him. If he broke his word, he would lose faith by showing that he couldn't be trusted. There was no way out that didn't hurt his reputation and power. Finally, his shoulders drooped. "Fine," he said in a voice that was barely audible. "Take your freedom. You can keep the $50 and leave my property. I never want to see you again," Tobias said slowly. "I'll need the money in writing. A document stating that I'm free, signed by you and witnessed by these men. Otherwise, I'll be captured as a runaway the moment I leave here." Vandermeer's jaw clenched. but he knew Tobias was right. He turned to Dalton. Prepare the papers and get him his money. It took nearly an hour to prepare everything. Vandermeer's personal secretary was summoned to write out a formal document of manumission declaring that Tobias was hereby freed from slavery and granted $50 as payment for services rendered. Vandermeer signed it with a shaking hand, and 3 of the neighboring plantation owners signed as witnesses. Their faces showed a range of emotions, from confusion to interest. Meanwhile, Tobias stood quietly with the 20 bulls around him. Workers brought him water, which he drank slowly, and some bread, which he ate in small bites. The bulls stayed calm, moving around a bit but never leaving Tobias's side. When the papers were finally ready, Dalton brought them too. Tobias gave him a small leather pouch with $50 in coins inside. Tobias took the papers, read them carefully, folded them up, and put them in his shirt. He took the pouch and nodded his thanks. "Where will you go?" "Where?" Dalton asked quietly. He had always treated Tobias with more respect than the other overseers, and there was real curiosity in his question. Tobias looked east toward the dense pine forest that stretched for miles beyond the plantation. "Somewhere quiet," he said. "Somewhere we can live in peace." "We?" Dalton asked, glancing at the bulls. Tobias smiled slightly. "Yes, we." He began walking toward the road that led away from the plantation, and the bulls followed. They moved in a loose procession, some walking beside him, others behind, forming a protective formation around him. The crowd parted to let them through. Workers and overseers and plantation owners all stepping aside, watching in stunned silence as this impossible parade passed by. Some of the enslaved workers reached out as Tobias passed, not touching him, but extending their hands as if seeking some kind of blessing or confirmation that what they were seeing was real. A few were crying, though they couldn't explain why. Others whispered prayers or made signs against evil, unsure whether what they were witnessing was divine or demonic. Tobias walked down the long dirt road that led away from the plantation, the morning sun rising behind him, casting his shadow and the shadows of 20 bulls long across the ground. He didn't look back. He just kept walking steadily and with purpose, and the bulls followed. Vandermeer watched from the rear of his main house. His hands were gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face was twisted with an expression that combined rage, fear, and something else, a kind of existential horror, as if he were watching the collapse of everything he believed about the world and his place in it. Margaret stood beside him, her hand on his arm, trying to offer comfort. But Vanir didn't seem to notice her. He just stared at thee. Tobias and his procession of bulls were seen from a distance until they disappeared into the trees. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at Vandermeer's plantation spread throughout Georgia and beyond. Newspapers picked up the tale, though they treated it with skepticism, suggesting that the accounts had been exaggerated, or that there was some rational explanation that hadn't been properly investigated. Religious leaders debated whether Tobias had been blessed by God or cursed by the devil. Scientists and naturalists wrote letters to journals proposing theories about animal behavior and human-animal communication. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed it firsthand, no amount of skepticism or theorizing could change what they had seen. Tobias had survived 3 days with 6 killer bulls. 20 bulls had followed him when he left. These were facts documented by dozens of witnesses, and no one could explain them away. The neighboring plantation owners, whose by God or cursed by the devil. Scientists and naturalists wrote letters to journals proposing theories about animal behavior and human-animal communication. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed it firsthand, no amount of skepticism or theorizing could change what they had seen. Tobias had survived 3 days with 6 killer bulls. 20 bulls had followed him when he left. These were facts documented by dozens of witnesses, and no one could explain them away. The neighboring plantation owners The Bulls owners were furious with Vandermeer. They wanted him to pay for their lost animals, saying that he had somehow lured them away or that his slave had used some trick to steal them. Vanneer refused to pay, saying that he had nothing to do with it and that the Bulls had left on their own. The arguments turned into lawsuits that would last for years, costing Vandermeer a lot of money and ruining his relationships with his peers. The social effects were even worse. Vandermeer's reputation was ruined. The story of how a slave beat him, survived his punishment, and walked away free with 20 bulls following him became a source of mockery and gossip throughout the region. Other plantation owners began to question his judgment, authority, and competence. Invitations to social gatherings dried up. Business deals fell through. He became isolated, a man who had lost the respect of his peers. But the worst effects were psychological. Vanneer became. He was obsessed with finding out what had happened. He spent hours in his study reading books about animal behavior, African religions and folk practices, and anything else that might explain Tobias's gift. He talked to people he would have once called charlatans, root workers, folk healers, and traveling preachers who claimed to know about the supernatural. He wanted answers, needed answers, but none were coming. His behavior became more and more erratic. Workers said they saw him walking the grounds at night. He would stand by the empty bullpen for hours, staring at the ground where Tobias had sat, as if searching for some clue written in the mud. He stopped sleeping regularly, stopped eating properly, and stopped maintaining the careful facade of control that had defined his public persona. Margaret tried to help him, tried to convince him to let it go, to move on, but Vanneer couldn't. He had built his entire identity around the idea of control. Control over his property, his. Vandermeer's power was based on the idea that he could control everything. His workers, his animals, and his world. But Tobias had completely shattered that illusion. If one man could do what Tobias had done, and if the natural order could be changed so easily, what did that say about Vandermeer's power? What did it say about the whole system he had built his life around? The plantation's productivity dropped sharply. Workers whispered that the land itself had turned against Vandermeer, that crops were failing in fields that had always been fertile. Horses became skittish and hard to manage, even. The dogs seemed nervous, barking at nothing and refusing to go into some parts of the property. Whether these problems were real or imagined, the result of Vanneer's declining attention to management or just bad luck, they added to the feeling that something fundamental had broken. About 6 weeks after Tobias left, a traveling preacher came through Valdosta and stopped at a tavern to tell anyone who would listen a strange story. He said that while traveling through the backwoods of Southern, in Georgia, he met a man who lived in a clearing deep in the woods. The man was surrounded by bulls. The preacher counted at least 20, and they all lived together in what could only be called harmony. The bulls grazed peacefully, the preacher said, his hands shaking as he told the story, and the man moved among them without fear. I tried to get closer to offer Christian guidance, but the man looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through me, and I felt so uneasy that I turned around and ran away. It wasn't normal. That man wasn't right. The bulls looked at me like they were guarding him, like they would kill for him if he asked. When Vandermeer heard this story, which spread quickly as gossip does, he became sure that Tobias was practicing some kind of dark art in the woods. He started making plans to find him, confront him, and somehow undo whatever had been done. He talked about putting together a search party, offering rewards for information, and forcing Tobias to explain his methods. But these plans never materialized. Vanneer's mental state continued to deteriorate. He began experiencing what he described as visions, seeing bulls standing outside his windows at night, hearing their breathing, feeling their eyes on him even when he was alone in locked rooms. His wife and servants tried to convince him that these were hallucinations, products of stress and lack of sleep, but Vanir insisted they were real. "He's watching me, Vanir." He would say this while looking out the window of his study into the dark. "Tobias, he's out there with those bulls, and he's watching me. He knows what I'm thinking. He knows what I'm going to do. Please don't bother me." 3 months after Tobias left on a hot July night, Baron Wilhelm Vandermeer locked himself in his study. He told Margaret not to bother him because he had important business to take care of. She had heard this before and knew better than to argue. So she went to her room. The house became quiet as usual at night. The next morning, when the staff knocked on the study door to bring breakfast, there was no answer. They knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Dalton was called. He tried the door and found it locked from the inside. He called out to Vandermeer. Silence. Dalton was worried and ordered the door to be broken down. It took 3 men with a heavy beam to finally break the lock and force the door open. What they found inside would haunt. Baron Wilhelm Vandermeer sat slumped over in his chair behind his desk, his head resting on his arms. At first, they thought he had just fallen asleep, but when Dalton touched his shoulder, the body was cold and stiff. Vanir had been dead for hours. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no blood, no signs of poison or struggle. The room was exactly as it always was: books on shelves, papers on the desk, and a half-empty glass of brandy. The windows were closed and locked from the inside, and the door had been locked from the inside as well. No one could have gotten in or out. But the most disturbing thing about Vanir was his face. His eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, and his hands were so tightly clenched that his fingernails had drawn blood from his palms. Every muscle in his face was twisted in an expression of complete and utter terror. The doctor who looked at the body couldn't find a reason for death. The heart had just stopped. "It's as if," the doctor said carefully, choosing his words. He was literally scared to death. It was as if he saw something so scary that his heart couldn't take it. They found a piece of paper on the desk under Vandermeer's arm. It was covered in frantic handwriting that was hard to read. The words scrolled in a hurry. Dalton picked it up and read it aloud to the others. "They're here, all of them, standing outside the window. 20 bulls just standing, watching, waiting. He's with them, Tobias. He's standing in the center, and he's looking at me. He's looking through the window, through the walls, through everything. He sees me. He knows. They all know. They're not moving, just watching, just waiting. I can hear them breathing. I can hear their hearts beating. I can hear his heart beating. It sounds like thunder. It sounds like the earth itself. They're not leaving. They're never leaving. They're going to stand there forever, watching, waiting until I—" The writing ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page as if Vandermeer's hand had simply stopped working mid-sentence. Dalton immediately sent men to check the grounds outside the study windows. They found nothing, no hoofprints, no tracks, no evidence that any animals had been there at all. The grass was undisturbed. The ground was dry and hard from weeks without rain. There was no physical evidence to support what Vandermeer had written, but 7. In the days after Vandermeer's death, workers came forward on their own and without talking to each other to say that they had heard something strange. Around midnight, they heard what sounded like distant bellowing, the deep, resonant calls of bulls. But when they looked outside, they saw nothing. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing across the plantation like a warning or a judgment. One worker, an older woman named Ruth, who had been the plantation's cook, said, something that others would remember for years afterward. "That sound," she said, "it wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening. It was just there, like the bulls were saying, 'We remember. We know what you did, and we're watching.' That's what it sounded like to me, like a reminder that some things can't be forgotten, no matter how much you want to forget them." Baron Wilhelm Vanier was buried in the family plot on the plantation grounds. The funeral was small and awkward. Few of the neighboring plantation owners attended, but those who did left quickly because they were uncomfortable with the whispers and rumors that had surrounded Vanier's death. The preacher who led the service kept his remarks short and general, avoiding any mention of the circumstances of Vandermeer's last months. Margaretha Van Meer sold the plantation within 6 months. She couldn't stand to stay there, couldn't sleep in the house where her husband had died in such a disturbing way. She returned to the Netherlands with what was left of. The family's wealth had been greatly reduced by lawsuits and a drop in productivity. She never remarried and never talked about her husband's death in public. When family members asked, she would just say he lost himself. He became obsessed with something he couldn't understand, and it ruined him. Over the next 10 years, the plantation changed hands 3 times. Each new owner reported strange problems, like crop failures, livestock dying mysteriously, and workers refusing to stay after dark. There was a general sense of unease on the property. The main house, which had once been so grand and imposing, fell into disrepair. The fields grew wild and the worker quarters were left empty. Eventually, the property was sold to a timber company for a small fraction of its original value. The company clear-cut the forests, leaving the land barren. By the 1870s, all that was left of Vandermeer's plantation were a few crumbling foundations, and the family plot where the Baron was buried. Even that eventually disappeared, overgrown by vegetation, the headstones. The names were worn away by the weather and time, and the things that had fallen apart. No one who could be trusted ever saw Tobias again. But stories lived on, passed down through the years. Each version was a little different, but they all had some things in common. Travelers who passed through the deep woods of southern Georgia sometimes said they saw a man living among bulls in remote clearings. Some said he was young, others said he was old, and some said he was black. Some people said his skin had taken on a strange weathered quality that made it hard to tell what race he was. But some things stayed the same. The man was always calm and quiet, and the bulls around him were always peaceful, almost reverent in his presence. Some said he had built a life in the wilderness, free from the world of plantations and bondage, living in harmony with creatures that others feared. Others said he was a ghost, a spirit that had never truly left the mortal world, doomed to wander with his. Strange companions for eternity. A few whispered that he had become something more than human, that his time in the bullpen had transformed him into a kind of guardian spirit for all animals that suffered under human cruelty. There was one account recorded in a journal kept by a surveyor named Thomas Whitley in 1851 that stands out among all the others. Whitley was mapping territory in the remote backcountry when he came across a clearing he described as unnaturally perfect. A circle of grass surrounded by dense forest, as if the trees themselves had decided not to grow there. In the center of the clearing he saw a man sitting cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by bulls. Whitley counted 23 of them. The man looked up as Whitley approached, and Whitley wrote that he felt an overwhelming compulsion to stop walking, to go no further. His eyes, Whitley wrote, were not the eyes of a man who had suffered. They were the eyes of someone who had transcended suffering entirely, who had found something beyond it. I cannot explain. The trees themselves had decided not to grow there. In the middle of the clearing, he saw a man sitting cross-legged on the ground with 23 bulls around him. The man looked up as Whitley got closer, and Whitley wrote that he felt an overwhelming urge to stop walking and go no further. Whitley said that the man's eyes were not the eyes of someone who had suffered. They were the eyes of someone who had gone beyond suffering and found something beyond it. I can't explain. I don't know how I felt at that moment, but I knew without words that I wasn't welcome. Not because he hated me, but because I didn't belong there. It was his world, and I was just passing through. The bulls watched me with the same calm attention, and I knew for sure that if I took another step forward, they would stop me. Not violently, but they would stop me. So I turned around and left. Whitley never went back to that clearing, and when he tried to find it again years later he couldn't find it on his own maps. He decided that the clearing had either never existed or had stopped existing the moment he left. The story of Tobias and the 20 bulls became a legend in southern Georgia, passed down through generations. It was told in different ways depending on who was telling it and who was listening. To enslaved people and their descendants, it became a story of resistance and transcendence, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, there were ways to maintain dignity, and, to white Southerners, it became a warning story about the dangers of underestimating those they thought were less than them, or a ghost story to scare kids. But everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever Tobias had done in that bullpen, whatever understanding he had reached with those animals, it was something that couldn't be explained. There were a lot of witnesses, and they were all credible. The facts were written down. Baron Vandermeer's death was recorded in official county records. The disappearance of the bulls was confirmed. By many property owners, these things happened. They were real, but the mechanism, the reason, the truth behind it all that remains hidden, locked away in the same silence that Tobias carried with him into the wilderness. A silence that 20 bulls understood, but that no human ever could. In the end, we're left with questions that have no answers. Was Tobias born with a gift? Or did he learn something in his years of suffering that others never could? Were the bulls drawn to him by instinct or by something? Was it a deeper understanding of kinship between creatures who had both been broken and caged? And what did Baron Vandermeer see in those last moments before his heart stopped? Was it really Tobias and 20 bulls standing outside his window? Or was it something else? Guilt, fear, and the weight of his own cruelty showing up as a vision he couldn't escape. Was it a hallucination caused by stress and obsession? Or was it something more? Something that made him think the world is stranger and more connected than we. Do you understand? That cruelty and suffering leave marks that can't be erased? That some debts must eventually be paid? We'll never know for sure. The plantation is gone, reclaimed by forest and time. The people who saw these things happen are long dead. And Tobias took his secrets with him wherever he went. But even now, people traveling through the remote backwoods of southern Georgia sometimes hear something strange at night. A sound like distant bellowing, deep and resonant, echoing through the trees, and they sometimes find circles of flattened grass in clearings where no one has lived or built for over 100 years. It looks like large animals rested there, but there are no tracks or signs of how they got there or where they went. Just empty clearings and the feeling that something strange happened there once. Something that changed the rules, even if only for a moment. Something that reminded us that the world is stranger and deeper than we can ever fully understand. And maybe that's the real terror. Not monsters or ghosts or not just supernatural forces, but also the idea that reality itself has cracks in it. Places where the normal rules don't apply. Times when a man can walk into a pen with 6 killer bulls and walk out 3 days later with 20 following him like shadows. Times when the impossible becomes undeniably terrifyingly real. Times that make us question everything we think we know about power, control, the nature of consciousness and connection, and what it means to truly understand another. The story of Tobias and the 20 bulls is one of those times. It happened, and there is proof. But the explanation is still just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite remember. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay that way, to remind us that even with all our science, logic, and rational explanations, there are still things in this world that we don't understand. We wonder late at night when we're alone with our thoughts if the world is really as solid and predictable as we like to think it is, or if there are cracks in the foundation where something older, deeper, and more mysterious can slip through. Something that operates by rules we've forgotten or never knew. The story of Tobias is one of those cracks, and it is still open more than a century and a half later. A question without an answer. A mystery without a solution. A reminder that some things that were seen can never be explained away. What do you think of this story? Do you think Tobias really had a gift? Or was there a logical explanation that no one found? Could Vanir's death have been caused only by guilt and fear, or was something else going on? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this, to learn more about one of history's most disturbing mysteries, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, remember that the past is full of mysteries, and some of them won't stay buried.